Next up, we will hear about the drive from the charitable sector to encourage cooperation between government, private companies, and academia in order to further issues related to securing a safe future for food supply. He's the head of the Middle East branch of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. If I'd like to welcome Hassan Al-Damluji to the stage, please. Thank you very much.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I very much enjoyed the last speeches, so it was a pleasure listening to them. I promise actually very little data. The last speaker gave much more, which was very interesting data than he set out to not have a data-rich presentation. Fascinating statistics, so thank you for that. I also promise not to give out any money, but I do want to build on all of the data you've just seen, which is a really nice backdrop, to just tell you three things. One is why we care about agriculture. And secondly, I want to set out why we think people in the GCC care about agriculture, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong. And then set out a couple of ways that we might be able to collaborate. I just was reflecting on the seeing climate change point that the last speaker made. You know, I'm Iraqi-British, and so I have a house near the Thames and a house near the Tigris, and the Thames is now underwater. The whole of Britain is flooded in the south, and the Tigris is now 1/3 the width that it was, you know, when I was a child. So also something that you see around you these days, you don't just have to look at figures. So why do we care about agriculture in the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation? Well, as you may know, we're the largest philanthropic foundation in the world. We spend about $4 billion a year in grants that we give directly to organizations without looking for return, in addition to about $1.5 billion of investments that we make that are linked to what we're trying to achieve in terms of our charitable purposes. And we start from the premise that every life has equal value. That's the starting point. And so what do we do? Well, what we're trying to do is to remove the barriers that the poorest people in the world face to a healthy and productive life. Okay? If you're trying to remove those barriers, then of course diseases which kill people even before the age of 5 and also lead to them being for the rest of their lives paralyzed in the case of polio, so other diseases such as malaria, of course they're central to what we're trying to do, but agriculture is incredibly important within that mix. The last speaker mentioned 1.2 billion people living below the poverty line in the world. About 900 million of those 1.2 billion depend on agriculture because they're either farmers or they are urban poor that spend more than 50% of their income on food. And so they're critically linked to the productivity of the local farmers. So I want to ask you, if you will, to picture a farming family in Kenya. Smallholder farm, maybe a farm the size of this room, or maybe slightly bigger, the size of a football pitch. Now, a lot of people, when they imagine a farmer, they would imagine a man, but I'd like you to imagine a woman, because 68% of the poorest farmers are women. She works hard, she has a back-breaking job, a lot of manual labor, and in a good year, she feeds her family, and she also makes enough money that she can send her children to school. And maybe her children will be better educated, have more opportunities, and the cycle of poverty can be broken. The problem is there aren't enough good years. So in a year that's not so good, her crop could be destroyed by drought, or it could be destroyed by disease. In a different year, she may not be able to produce the variety of food that allows her to feed her children a diet that has all the right nutrients. And when she does make excess produce to sell, often there's no market. You go to some villages in Africa and you work with them on improving the production, they say, why would I produce more? There's no one I can sell it to. So these are the barriers that stop her from being able to enter that positive cycle. And so this woman and hundreds of millions like her around the world, that's why we care about agriculture. You know, throughout the middle especially of the 20th century, there was an agricultural revolution in the rich world, which hugely increased yields and productivity. And that was a great thing. And that agricultural revolution didn't reach our farmer in Kenya, nor across Africa and South Asia. We could be talking of many countries. And we don't think it's fair that she didn't have that access. So that's why we care about agriculture. And so what do? We invest in all the things that we see as necessary that wouldn't be happening otherwise for the crops and livestock that she produces from start to finish. That could be research into new kinds of seeds which are resistant to the drought that she suffers or resistant to the disease. It could be a program to eradicate disease or push it back in certain areas. Or it could be making investments that are required to connect that farmer to a real market for their produce, for her produce. Okay, so that's our starting point. And we have hundreds of different investments in agriculture, both research grants to universities in America or elsewhere, and projects on the ground in places like Kenya. So secondly, why do we think people in the Gulf care about agriculture? Well, the first reason, this conference's title says it all, food security, okay? There's a food security risk. There's bad news. There's a risk. Not enough groundwater. Desalination costs too much and has a lot of energy costs and has ecological side effects. But if we buy our food from abroad, is it secure? We're even more likely to have price shocks. And what if there's a war and the whole supply is cut off? So there's risks. And that's why people care. But secondly, I think also people in the Gulf care because in an increasingly knowledge-based economy, leaders and thinkers in this region believe that this is a great area for comparative advantage for the Gulf. If we have a challenge that we need to face, plus the resources and the ambition to develop a knowledge-based economy, then this is an area we should have expertise in. And that means creating global goods that aren't just about solving the very specific 2014 UAE problem, but about global knowledge and global solutions. And I think thirdly, GCC leaders and also people care deeply, like us, about the poorest people in the world. It's ingrained in our religion, it's ingrained in our culture. And so, for exactly the same reasons that I set out above as to why we care about agriculture, I think people in the GCC care about it too. And then, fourthly, I think that investors and governments in the GCC realize that the best way to secure the investments they're making abroad is to have a social benefit to the people from those investments. So far more power than in a cleverly worded contract that in theory secures the rights to your investment with a government is that our farmer in Kenya, our lady, feels that she's benefiting because there's an investment from a Gulf country in the next door farm. She's now getting better seeds. She's now has more access to water. Then she's going to ask her government to maintain that investment rather than the opposite. So it's sensible for investment. It's sensible for a focus within the knowledge-based economy that's growing. It's definitely sensible for food security, but it's also sensible for exactly the same reasons that we have, which is that we do care about the poorest people in the world. So this is my reading of why we care and why people in this region care. And based on that, you can see that there may be some overlapping interests. And I didn't want to talk for too long, I want to leave some time for questions, and I'd also be very happy, because I feel bad that the last questions were cut short, if you have questions for the other speaker. So what I wanted to do was finish by getting quite concrete and suggesting, okay, so what then could the type of collaboration between the Gates Foundation and people in the region look like? Should start off by saying that, this is a region that we are very excited in, and that's been shown by Bill Gates coming here quite frequently over the recent years, and inshallah he'll be back soon. And it's been shown by my team, which we've only just created recently. So very high level of excitement, but it's still early days. So these are really ideas that I want to throw out there and be interested in public or private to hear people's thoughts. So research institutes, we invest a lot in combating wheat rust, because wheat is one of the staple crops that our lady farmer in Kenya makes, and we know that she's at threat. Actually, it's very often in South Asia is the real problem, and we invest heavily in that. The GCC is a huge consumer of wheat, and in order to maintain its food security, research into wheat rust and how to push back that disease is something we could collaborate on. The GCC region also imports a huge amount of livestock from East Africa. So research into the diseases that affect livestock or into livestock breeding for those countries is in the interests of the food security of this region. It's also something we invest in order to help those farmers. For the government, well, we think there's no better way to improve the image, but also the genuine social good of the investments that are going on at a national scale. If, for example, a small proportion of the national food procurement could be reserved for smallholder farmers at minimal marginal cost to the overall program. 2% of all the food we buy will be from the poorest farmers in the world. And we could work together to ensure that the route to market is there, so that it doesn't have to be airlifted by a helicopter, but the route to market is there. And for private investors, well, there are many profitable investments along the value chain of the crops and livestock that the poorest farmers in the world produce, in order to connect them to the market, which are both profitable investments and also we would be interested in because we want to connect them to the market. So, for example, investing in processing plants for livestock in Ethiopia, so that rather than importing live animals, those animals can be processed and imported. It's less hassle, it's less risk hygienically, and it's, of course, creating a market for those farmers. The majority, of course, of Ethiopian livestock is exported to the GCC. This is the main market for them. So those are just a few quite tangible ideas of how partnership with research institutes, government, and private investors who have, of course, their own interests at heart, but also want to have a positive impact on the world, can work with the Gates Foundation. I just want to finish by saying that, the 2 speakers ago, someone said, everyone's got funding constraints unless you're Bill Gates. Actually, we have funding constraints because with the increased resources that we have, that we're blessed with, we have even more ambition. And so we want to lift 75 million farmers in Africa and South Asia, productivity by 3 times almost, a little under 3 times in Africa, and more than double in South Asia by 2030. And that would, we believe, lift 400 million people out of poverty. This is a huge task. And actually, $4 billion a year, of which agriculture is just one program, then becomes not enough. So we're big funders, but we want to partner with other people because it's a global effort. And very interested in catching up with anyone who wants to discuss that further. I must note that I will be leaving very soon after, so inshallah the organizers can pass my details to anyone who was unable to catch me. Thank you very much.
Hassan, thank you ever so much for your presentation. It's, for want of a better expression, food for thought. Will you have time for a couple of questions from the floor?
Yeah.
Perfect. Is there anything from the floor you'd like to address? 1 second, please.
So we are talking about food security problems, and for both speakers, Hassan and the speaker before, we keep talking about the same crops: wheat, maize, and rice. And we know that 60% of protein of people is taken from these 3 crops. Our principle is that we started with the bad food. We are just focusing on few crops, whereas there is 7,000 species out there that are very, very interesting. So in that perspective, I would like to ask both speakers, what do you think about enlarging a little bit what's on the diet of the people? That's one. So what about neglected and underutilized species? And the second question is, what about marginal environments? Because as you know, differently in Gate Foundation, behind marginal environments, there are marginalized people. So if you go in the poor and you want to look for the poorest of the poor, you're going to find them in marginal environments. So what about why we are focusing on arable land, why we are focusing on those 4 crops, why not enlarge it?
So maybe you can give the microphone also to the last speaker to respond if he has a response. So I think there are many different ways of trying to address the problem. And one of the ways that you can increase your leverage is by partnering with other people. Another way is to focus on specific problems. So put simply, we don't have enough resources to solve every problem at the same time. And so what we've chosen to focus on is the smallholder farmers and how to improve their lives. We believe that that will lead to a better environment, and we try to make sure that all of our investments are sustainable. But ultimately, this is not a climate change strategy. It's one that we hope will contribute to that, and so on and so forth. So it's important to note that I don't think that what we're doing is the only thing that's important, and yet we need to focus. Secondly, we don't only focus on wheat, maize, and rice. We have 8 different crops that we focus on in addition to livestock. And the reason that we've chosen that, so sorghum, for example, which is not imported a lot by Europe, the Middle East, or America, but is actually the staple crop that people live on in Africa. The reason we chose those crops and those livestock is because these are currently the crops and livestock that the poorest people in the world farm and live from. So you could have an ambitious target to change entirely the way that they farm and then start improving those crops, but that would arguably be too late or over-ambitious. Let's start with what they're farming and help them to improve their lives. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't encourage them to do other stock. It's just that's where we've chosen to focus. The second point is, completely agree with you. And that's why one of the things we do is to try and develop crops which have better nutritional value. And the third point in terms of marginal environments, you're absolutely right again. A lot of the programs we have are about trying to create more crops which have a better production per water, for example, and then you do have an impact. But ultimately, there are many things that need to be done in order to stop climate change and prevent marginal environments, and we think we're contributing to that, but I'm not going to stand here and claim that we've got the solution.
First of all, thank you very much for asking a very important question. Indeed, it is true, all over the world, for the governments in order to fill the stomachs of the hungry population. The first priority was to do wheat, corn, rice, maize, which is taking care of immediate concern. And in the run-up to that, achieving that sufficiency, the quality crops, which are more nutritious, maybe less calorific in terms of staples or cereals, they were ignored. A simple example of such crop is legumes, pulses, beans, lentils, which in last 60 years are a flat production at between 60 to 65 million tons. Are they not good crop? Of course they are a good crop. But they are difficult to grow because not enough R&D has gone into them. So the yields are still very low in those countries where they are largely grown in, which is Asia and Africa. But just a simple example, these crops, they contain about 25 to 35% of protein, which is vegetable protein. That means you can imagine out of 300 million tons of meat, which we use in the world, which requires 4.5 billion tons of agricultural crops to grow, 60 million tons is already available in the form of protein. If we just extract this protein, use in our meat processing industry, we can't claim to have solved it, but at least we mitigate the quality paradigm. So that is one example, and there I'm very, very, very happy to report that the foundation, as a confederation, we are working very closely with the foundation, and recently 2016 has been declared as the year of pulses and legumes in United Nations. So things are happening, but of course at the pace and with the vigor they need to happen, it will take some time, but the very fact that we are having this World Food Security Summit in Dubai on a critical issue, I think we are reaching somewhere. Thank you very much.